Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at Smith Weekly, including Ryan S., Jackie A., at DJC379-86880, Nick W., and Sean M. On the program today is a new guest of a company that has been on the program in the past. Mr. Steve Blower has joined us. Steve is the chairman of Cosa Resources, an Athabasca Basin focused uranium exploration company that is focused on advancing a number of uranium exploration prospects, primarily on the east side of the basin. The team at Cosa has had recent past success with uranium discovery in the basin. The company is listed on the Toronto Venture Exchange under the symbol COSA, as well as on the US OTC markets under the symbol COSAF. Steve, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good to talk to you. Good to finally get you on the program. Well, first time on the program, Steve, and I appreciate you selecting Smith Weekly to have a conversation, as I can appreciate very much that remaining selective on exposure is important. Why don't we start off here first with you covering your relevant background and experience as a geologist in the natural resource sector and specifically in this uranium segment?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I am a geologist. Several aspects of the business that I've done over my career, which is now a fairly long career. Quite a bit of exploration, certainly, and then some mine geology at open pit copper mines in British Columbia and resource estimating consulting after that. And then honestly, I was missing being in the exploration business through those stretches of my career, and exploration is why I got into geology in the first place. So yeah, in about 2006, I guess I had an opportunity to get back into exploration. Was really missing it, and that ended up being uranium in the Athabasca Basin. So yeah, somewhere around 17 years ago. And now, yeah, I'm into a fourth uranium exploration company doing work in the Athabasca, I guess five if you include another one that I'm a director of. So yeah, so really that's my story. That's my career history.
I'd like to have you also just cover your thoughts on the uranium market today from a geologist perspective, of course, which is always good to have. How do you look at this uranium market?
I mean, obviously, very exciting times at the moment. It's great to be a part of the sector with uranium screaming up through $100 a pound. And of course, mentioned that I started in the uranium business back in about 2006, and that was really the kind of the heart of the last uranium boom. And so that was obviously another exciting time. So I've kind of come a full cycle here, been through a couple of peaks now, and a big long trough. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting time. The work is more fun. Capital flows much more easily when the uranium price is booming. So it's a good time to be in uranium exploration.
It's always good to get different people's perspective on things here and where we're headed and how the outlook looks for this sector and
Yeah.
just where we are on price and how quickly it changed and quickly from the sense that you've been in here longer than I have, but certainly 7 years for us is a bit long, but we're still here and we were able to stay here as well. And it's just good to see this come back around in the right
Hmm.
direction and at a price I think that reflects to some degree the problems that are in this sector.
Yeah, sure. You bet. It's really interesting. I get asked a lot, of course, are there any differences that you see between this current boom and the previous one? And I think there are a lot of differences actually. And it makes me think that this one, I mean, everybody always says the peak is going to last longer than the last one, but it does make me think that that might be a little bit true here in this case. Last time, 2006, 2007, the price came off quite quickly as really as the Kazakhs started to really ramp up production, right, and essentially flooded the market. And at the same time, Cigar Lake got their mining issues sorted out, and so there was lots of supply coming out of there. And so I think that was really the reason that the uranium price fell off. And then it was sort of exacerbated by the Fukushima event, of course. in 2011 when all the reactors in Japan were shut down and others across the globe were shut down also. And so, yeah, we had that long trough, right? I think we saw what, $16 somewhere back in around, I don't know, 2017 or something to that effect. And then we've been on a pretty steady climb up since. And I think the real difference this time around is that there are not any major producers set to flood the market. The closest one that I see coming would likely be NextGen. They haven't really started building that thing yet, so they're probably a little ways off yet. So I think there's a really good chance that we've got a few years of some, good sustained high uranium prices ahead of us here.
Yeah, as you and I both know, operational and construction success is very difficult to come by in this sector specifically. It's very hard to get a line of sight to any major greenfield project actually being successful, especially ones of super scale and that have basically record breaking features about every one of them. It's hard to imagine record breaking happening all together perfectly in succession when those types of large scale projects haven't been built in this sector in that region for decades. Where are those people, and is there truly the expertise required to get there? And there's very few out there that are able to do that, not to mention all the other risks that you and I both know that come with operatorship, which is so different than exploration, as you well know. I'd like to get into COSA in a moment, but
Mm-hmm.
how about you take us back here? And this is a highlight here that we need to talk about because it's recent, it's fresh in our memory. But walk us through the success of ISO Energy and the discovery at Hurricane from essentially how that initial drilling was determined there, Steve, the work that was being conducted in the background to deploy that program that caused discovery, and then just that work that went into the target selection, maybe some of the challenges that happened, and then just how Hurricane evolved from there, which ultimately became a takeout. The discovery team left, but just talk about that particular phase of that initial work that created quite a bit of value.
Sure, you bet. So ISO Energy, I was there for about 5 years, really about when it started. Craig Perry, who was one of the founders of NextGen, led the spin out of ISO Energy, and then he ran that company for about 5 years, and I was there for most of that. And boy, it was probably the best 5 years of my career. Really, hats off to Craig. Honestly, he's just a tremendous guy to work with, and did a remarkable job with that company. Well, heck, both with getting NextGen started and getting ISO started. And yeah, we ended up just with a really remarkable team of geologists, and because NextGen essentially held 51% of our shares. They participated in every financing. It made financing relatively easy compared to what others were going through during that trough of the uranium market, and really just allowed us to capitalize on the trough and go out and acquire some assets that others just couldn't get. Everybody else was kind of cocooning and not doing anything, but we were actually fairly aggressive, and we managed to get a few really nice pieces of ground. We called them Geiger, and then Larock East, which was Cameco's old Kernahan property, for relatively cheap. It was just the state of the market at the time. And Larock East in particular, which used to be called Kernahan Lake, was a property that had, a smattering of old historical drill holes completed by Cameco in the past. Got some sniffs of uranium, but it was along a pretty fertile trend, the Larock trend, which to the west of Larock East had a couple of deposits on it. Well, one deposit called Larock Lake with some decent splash sections in it, but it never had much in the way of size. And then yeah, so we just liked the trend, and when we had an opportunity to get this Larock East property, we jumped on it, and like I said, it was cheap. So it was kind of a neat story because it all happened very quickly. We got the property. I think it was in I want to say May of 2018. We were actually just starting a drilling program on the Geiger property, which was nearby, and we had an 8-hole program in mind there. We drilled the first 7 holes that we didn't really hit much, weren't getting much joy, And so in the meantime, we'd run up and had a look at all this historical drill core at Laroque East and realized that there was some pretty decent looking targets, we thought, especially over on the west end of Laroque East. There were some holes, historical holes that were fairly altered, a little bit mineralized at the unconformity, and hadn't really been followed up. So with our eighth and final hole of that Geiger program, we actually flew the drill up to Laroque East and drilled our favorite looking target at Laroque East. And again, this was just like 2 months after we'd acquired it. So this was June or July of 2018. And yeah, luckily with our very first drill hole, we hit, I think it was 1.3% over about 8 meters. We were away to the races. That was the discovery hole at Hurricane. First hole we ever drilled up at Laroque East, and 8 weeks after we bought the property. So it was great. And what a way to start. And then, of course, we just started drilling it out. And one thing that did happen was that we had a property boundary off to the west, a few hundred meters away from the discovery hole. And of course, it turned out that mineralization got better and better as we approached the property boundary. But it was quite spectacular, even on our side. Some drill holes of several tens of percent uranium over several meters, and yeah, it ended up being what ISO is calling the world's highest grade uranium deposit. So truly great, lots of fun. Really what made it fun was the team. I think we had Andy Carmichael, who's with us at Cosa, Justin Rodko, who's with us at Cosa. Those guys were the key geologists in the field for us, working on Hurricane, making the discovery, and then figuring out the geological controls on it that led to it being a pretty decent sized deposit. So yeah, really great. It's my understanding Cameco's working on it on their side of the property boundary now, over on the west side, and so it'll be interesting to see how big the thing actually becomes.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting there, Steve, and just with the transaction that occurred, how that pro forma co will be able to take care of delineating that deposit further and advancing it. So that'll be another one just to watch as far as, what the interest is of actually moving it forward relatively quickly, or if it's something that just kind of gets put on the back burner. And then Cameco, as you said, you're an interesting boundary right there with respect to that. And the jury has pretty much decided that this extends clearly into Cameco's land there as well. So makes sense there to probably take a look at it as exploration capital starts to come up here, and obviously pipelines have to be expanded and built. We know that some of these projects that are in production in that area are later stages of their lives, and obviously we have to replace pounds, and it'd be interesting to see who starts to do that first, right?
Yeah, I think both Cameco and Orano. I mean, that's actually a JV on the other side of that property boundary. Those guys, I think, would both like to be adding to their pipeline of projects. So yeah, it's super interesting.
You've spent a good amount of time with some other parties out there on some discovery work and on the ground. When you look back at this and you look at, the success at ISO and obviously what you guys are planning to do with COSA and have already been doing with COSA with some of the successes on property acquisition and definement of the plans on what property is going to go first and so forth. But just looking back over your time of looking at these various deposits, these discoveries in the basin that have been significant, and based on the various companies that you've had experience with, what do you think, Steve, is some of the key ingredients to really facilitate a good discovery in the basin?
I think there's a lot of ingredients that go into it, right? But I think the exploration team is the key there. When I look back at, Denison before the ISO days, we had some success there too. Phoenix had been found before I got there, but we did manage to luck into the Griffin deposit, which is a sizable basement hosted deposit on the Wheeler River property that I think one day will complement what they're doing at Phoenix. And it's basement hosted. My point was that the team there was quite fantastic. I thought it was a real neat mix of young geologists who had just enough experience, knew what they were doing, along with some guys who had a lot of experience. So a few veterans in the crowd, and yeah, I thought it was just a tremendous mix of people that were really good at exploration, and I think we had something very similar at ISO. A mix of young, energetic, super bright people like Justin and Andy, and the odd grizzled old veteran like myself to round it out. So yeah, I think that's a really key component. I think it's helpful to be on the east side, to be honest. Not to discount what NextGen's done over on the west, but with all that infrastructure that's on the east side is very helpful for both exploration and putting projects into gear once you do find something. So the roads, the power lines, the mills especially. I think a 50 million pound deposit over on the east side is certainly something that could go into one of those existing mills, whereas you probably need something much larger if it's in an area that has no mills. So yeah, it's those sorts of things. It's a certain amount of perseverance. You've got to be willing to keep at it. You got to be willing to not be wrong, right? If you're afraid to be wrong in this business, you're not going to last very long. You tend to drill a lot of really super good ideas that turn out to be just nothing. And so yeah, you got to be willing to put up with that, and then hopefully you've got some people that believe in you that are raising the money. I mean, that's the other big factor, right? One of the real key components of exploration success, of course, is capital markets and being able to raise money, and that's really what drove, I would say, a lot of that success at ISO and at Denison. Was our access to capital, and that's thanks to guys like Craig Perry and Ron Hochstein at the time at Denison. So it's all those things have got to come together, really. And if you can do that, if you can bring it all together, then you've got a decent chance of success. I think that's where we're at with Cosa. We've got this incredible team. We've been around. We've done it before. We'll do it again. And we've got access to capital that is pretty much unparalleled. I think we're working on the east side where all that infrastructure is. So yeah, I'm really excited about what's coming up for Cosa.
It certainly is all about capital and being able to obviously provide very good information and data to those capital providers to make sure that they are writing the checks, and trying to be as efficient as possible on exploration obviously saves capital, but it is difficult to get it right on the first shot, and talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But yeah, I appreciate the comments there, and interesting times, and definitely it takes a lot of pieces and parts to get this right, and sometimes it's I suppose in some respects it's a bit of an art rather than a science, and sometimes it may not be. It may be more of the science that is part of it as well. So there's just a lot of variables, and obviously I think the biggest key piece from all of that is the experience, because if you have the experience, then the rest generally can start to fall in place, assuming you have obviously the ground as well. But experience to me could include the ability to raise capital, the ability to find good targets and facilitate a discovery. And so experience is super important in my opinion in this sector. And as you know, competency and experience are probably at its low in the sector at the same time. Well, we have a new audience, certainly since we've last talked to Keith at COSA. There's probably a few folks in the audience that probably haven't heard of COSA yet. So how about you give us just a quick overview of the company, and then we'll talk some more details.
After the discovery of ISO and drilling it out and all the excitement there, I think we were just kind of, some of us anyways, we're kind of looking for new horizons, honestly, something different to do. So we started to kind of peel away a little bit from ISO and decided that maybe we should, maybe try and list something ourselves. And so we ended up doing that on a copper project actually in Saskatchewan. It's really how COSA got started, the Heron project, which is still in the fold, but it's not something we're working on. We've clearly pivoted back to uranium now, but so we listed a company based on some copper assets near Janus Lake, which was being worked by Rio Tinto at the time. It was Forum's ground. I guess the crux of it was that, that drilling didn't go all that well for Rio, and our copper project wasn't looking all that spectacular because of that. So we started to look around at what else we ought to be doing, and obviously the uranium market was starting to go, and we had all this uranium experience, so we decided to pivot the company to uranium. It was a pretty simple decision, really. Probably, what was that? I want to say mid 22, something like that. We made that switch. So COSA is still quite new. Acquired some ground. Because the uranium price was starting to go a bit, it hasn't been that easy to get good ground, and so we we looked quite hard for quite a while for projects and realized that, well, pretty much everything in the eastern side had been staked up. Certainly any good ground, but we did realize that a bunch of claims over top of the Cable Bay Shear Zone were going to expire right around Christmas time, a year ago, a year and a month ago. Managed to pull together most of the ground on the Cable Bay Shear Zone, and at that time we realized that we suddenly had a real project, something that we could really sink our teeth into, and had a significant scale, prospectivity. It was the kind of place where there was still room to find elephant-sized deposits, and so that really got us excited and really has cemented Cosa as a uranium exploration company, and we've been going like crazy since. At that point, then suddenly we were clearly, as I said, a uranium exploration company. So Andy Carmichael joined us out of ISO to be our VP exploration. Justin Rodko joined us to look after the corporate development function, and Darren Morgans, our CFO, joined us at about the same time. So suddenly we had a kind of the band back together from the ISO days. We had Janine Richardson on the board. She was a CFO at ISO. So really a lot of ex-ISO people, a terrific team. Another guy that joined us on the board is Ted Truman, who wasn't a part of ISO, but he was running the first uranium exploration company that I got involved with in the basin back in the last boom, Pitchstone Exploration. And he's just one of the best uranium geologists I've ever met, and he's forgotten more than I'll ever know, and just a really vital piece of our board. So that's basically how Cosa got going.
Steve, that's great. I appreciate the background there, and you've actually covered quite a few people at the company that are going to be an important piece as we move forward here with the company. How about just on capital structure here? We like to check in on this frequently with our guests. Can you cover off for us where the company is on shares outstanding at this point, as well as the major investors in the company, including the management board and insiders?
I mean, Costa's still relatively young, so we're lucky in that we have quite a nice cap structure. I think Keith has done a really good job of looking after that. So we're about 46 million shares outstanding currently. We've really only had one significant raise since we listed, I believe, and that was largely to some uranium funds at the time. So we have about 21% institutional fund ownership, and management advisors. We've got 24% of the company. So it's tightly held, and there's just not many shares out. And I think you're starting to see that reflected in some of the price action lately. I did talk about a lot of the ex-ISO guys that have teamed up with us, or ex-ISO people, but I really didn't touch on Keith very much at all, and he's the most important piece of this whole thing. I've said before that I don't think you could build a better CEO for Cosa. He and I worked together at Denison. He's a uranium geologist, and then he went and did his MBA at UBC, and so he's this young powerhouse of a CEO that I think is just doing a remarkable job. And so watch out.
Yeah, Keith, I just really enjoyed talking with Keith on our last podcast, and just great leader here at this new company, and really appreciate that. And of course, Craig Perry as advisor, and yourself handling the board and some of the greater strategy on the ground, and appreciate that. And of course, Andy. We talked at a lot already. You mentioned a number of the people, and you feel free to mention any more at this point. But one of the other things here, the company has acquired some new projects recently, adding to the portfolio. It has sized up quite a bit since you guys got focused pretty hard back in 22 and into 23 and so forth on startup. Talk about what you see here now that you look at this portfolio and you guys put together the plans. What are you thinking in terms of things you'd like to accomplish on the exploration front this year, as far as field work, office review, testing, surveys, and potentially drilling here? And what do you think the first project focus will be for the team?
Sure. So, I think it certainly starts with Ursa. It is currently our flagship project. It is the most prospective in front of us, and for several reasons. I think I touched on a couple of them already, but probably the key one is that it's just this big trend that is known to be fertile. There's some weak uranium mineralization along it, and there is enough space to hide several elephant-sized deposits along it. So, ticks all those boxes. So that's what we're working on first. We're doing a lot of geophysics right now, making sure that when we do get in there with a drill, that our targets are as well developed as possible. Drilling in the Athabasca is certainly not a cheap venture. And so we want to make sure that we're drilling as efficiently as possible. And the king of that is Andy Carmichael. He's just so good at it. So yeah, we're working hard at that. And so that will be our first drill program coming up. We're actually going to get that started in this quarter. We're establishing the access in there right now in the camp, and we do expect to be drilling this winter in at Ursa. But what we'll also do is with that winter access, we'll bring in a lot of supplies and gear for a bigger program this summer, bigger drilling program that is. So that will be happening also. And one thing with Ursa is that the holes are fairly long. And so what we've seen a need for is to balance some of that with some shallower sandstone properties. And we've done that quite nicely just lately with things like Aurora down on the southeast corner. That's a new acquisition. Justin Rodko, corporate development manager, has done a terrific job of putting some of these projects together. That's a very recent acquisition. It's only about 17 kilometers away from the Key Lake Mill. It's right on the basin edge. Gosh, it's terrific. It's gained in stature in my eyes because some of the work I've been involved with 92 Energy, an ASX listed company of which I am on the board of, that has made a discovery at the GMZ, a very recent discovery, a really nice zone of basement hosted mineralization in that same general neighborhood on that southeastern corner of the Athabasca Basin. And I think has really increased the prospectivity of that whole area. So yeah, I'm very excited about Aurora. But we don't have drill ready targets there yet. We'll have to get in there, do some geophysics, and develop those targets and then get at it. So, if anybody has a map in front of them, they need to look at Orion also. We just added to that project with some ground that we acquired from Canalaska. They called it Titan. We've now bolted it on, and it's just expanded our Orion project. I love it because it's actually part of the Laroque Trend, which is near and dear to our hearts because that is the host of the Hurricane deposit. So big piece of ground, covers a long stretch of the Laroque Trend. I think we have a decent shot of finding something on there. Again, it needs more work before we're ready to drill it, but we'll get at that and make sure it's ready to drill as soon as we can.
Let's come back to Ursa for just a moment and just talk about specifically some of the next steps that you guys intend to complete there at Ursa. And then if you can speculate for us a little bit here, give us a flavor as to when you guys think that first drill program would kick off at Ursa to test some of those targets that you guys have defined for this initial program.
So it's an amazing project. It covers about 60 kilometers long along that Cable Bay shear zone. A known big crustal break. As I said, there are some uranium showings along it already. We know that the trend is fertile. There's 15 holes, I believe, historical drill holes along that 60 kilometer long length that are now within our Ursa property boundary. There are multiple what we call conductors within there, parallel conductors. And so within that 60 kilometer length of property, there are probably, I think, over 100 kilometers of electromagnetic conductors. And those conductors are important because they mark graphite in the basement. With geophysical techniques, we can't directly detect uranium deposits, but we can directly detect the rocks that tend to host them most often. And those are graphitic basement rocks. And so we see over 100 kilometers of these graphitic basement rocks at Ursa. And you can imagine with only 15 historical drill holes out there, some of which did hit weak uranium mineralization, there's just an incredible amount of potential there. So what we had to do is narrow down our focus. It's almost impossible to systematically drill over 100 kilometers of target zones efficiently. So we've gone in there with a lot of geophysics, started off with a big airborne mobile MT survey to both pinpoint those conductors better because they were originally found with some old, obsolete, outdated technology. And so we think we can improve on locating them, which I think we have done very well, but also then try to find what look like weakly conductive alteration zones in the sandstone and prioritize those for drilling along these 100 kilometers of conductors. And again, I think we've had huge success there. I think Andy likes to say that we've probably narrowed the prospectivity, the prospective conductors down from about 100 to maybe 20 kilometers or something like that. So that starts to be something that we can handle. So now we'll get down. We're currently there on the ground with more ground geophysics. Again, focusing our attention on those key areas and trying to delineate the target areas better ahead of getting in there with a drill. So yeah, the winter access is well underway. Camp is going in, and so we expect to be drilling. I would say by the end of this month. If not the first week of March, sort of a thing. So that's our projected schedule, but it all depends on many things, including weather. And so, yeah, hopefully things stay nice and cold and tight for the water crossings that we have to get across to get in there.
To talk just a little bit on the ground here, when you guys get kicked off with the drill program here pretty soon, so as that first hole gets drilled, talk a little bit about just how you guys are going to interpret that first core coming out in the field, and maybe some of the adjustments that happen in the field live when you guys are drilling. And I know some of this, of course, is to some degree, some of this boils in the field down to gut sense based on the adjustments and stuff that you see out
Mm-hmm.
there when you're drilling.
Yeah.
But just talk a little bit about some of that field work and how you
Mm-hmm.
guys may or may not adjust, or if you have a story you can tell us on prior drill programs that you've been on, just as
Mm-hmm.
far as, field adjustments and how that goes when, maybe that first core comes out, it doesn't come out as expected based on the modeling and the assumptions based on the data interpretations, or maybe it comes out better. Just talk about that. Give us a bit of a flavor.
I mean, typically what happens is that drills intersect the alteration zones around these uranium deposits first before they actually hit the uranium zones because the volume of the alteration is much larger and extends much further away from the zones than the uranium does itself. And so, you have to, first of all, I guess you have to be able to recognize that. So luckily we can tick that box. We kind of know what we're looking for. And if we get into some alteration, we should be able to vector towards mineralization. Every once in a while you get lucky. Like I said, with Hurricane, that was our first hole drilled on that project. We hit mineralization. That doesn't happen very often. 92 Energy, that was actually the fourth hole that we drilled on that project. That was spectacularly lucky, I would say. Obviously, lots of people did lots of good work on those targets, but nonetheless, it often takes many more holes. I think Wheeler River is a really good example for Denison. The Phoenix deposit, the first real serious uranium mineralization that was ever seen at Wheeler River was, I think, discovered with the 128th hole or something like that. It was 100 and something holes. That's the way it can go. I think that the work that Andy has done in trying to refine our targets at Ursa will certainly help us identify some alteration zones fairly quickly. And honestly, if it doesn't, we'll move off. We're not there to beat a dead horse by any means. We'll recycle projects as fast as we can if they're not turning out the way we want them to. Even when we were at ISO and we drilled that first hole up at Larock East and got success there, I mean, that was actually, I think we'd gone through 5 or 6 projects before we had success at Larock East. So I guess that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, Steve, that's good. And you put it in perspective too. And I like the terminology. We're not going to sit here and beat a dead horse. That goes far with us. So I appreciate that. And makes sense. If it's not working out and the thesis, the hypothesis, if you will, is broke, then it makes sense to continue to move on to the next prospect. And again, comes back to capital efficiency, right? And so
Yes.
you mentioned there at the end about ISO and some of the time it took, and that was one of the next things I was going to ask you about. Was one of the things that's interesting there is just putting discovery expectations into context, Steve. And you know,
Mm-hmm.
we hope to hit successfully on every drill hole, but the reality is it's often much different than that. And really, each hole drilled should always be a learning experience to adjust on the next hole. But often exploration programs can come up in, I suppose, oil words, dry. And I guess just wrap some context and some time around and just talk about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I touched on it briefly already. In this business, you just you can't be afraid to miss, right? You can't be afraid to be wrong, because it happens all the time. It's very rare that you drill a successful hole, and that doesn't mean that the ideas were bad by any means, right? Some of them I've drilled an awful lot of really terrific targets that were great ideas that just didn't pan out. The bottom line is you're looking through a bunch of barren sandstone with some geophysics and trying to come up with a chest of treasure that's down underneath of it all, and it's very difficult to find it. So I guess that's the best way to sum that up.
You're often blind. I mean, you certainly have tools you can use to help with that blindness, but often these things can be quite blind. So I appreciate that.
Hmm.
And I think folks, investors have to understand a little bit of patience here, that it takes some time and takes some effort to finally get there. Even if it looks initially on paper, looks to be maybe a failure, you have to put it all in a proper, I guess, picture, if you will, and have the right expectations and context around it.
You're absolutely right, and it's probably highly unlikely that we'll drill into significant uranium mineralization with our first ever program at Ursa. But what we hope to do, well, obviously we hope to drill into uranium mineralization with our first program, but outside of that, what's more likely is that we will drill into some decent looking alteration, hopefully with some elevated geochemistry and hopefully some signs of those graphitic rocks in the basement. And if we can get those things all coming together, then we'll know that we're reasonably close to something that might be significant. So then we'll vector towards it with future drilling, and that's the way this usually goes. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Andrew.
I think that's a good point to add. And improving the confidence level with the team is also another important piece, that the likelihood of that success becomes better as well. Steve, you're a geologist, and as you know, you and I've talked about this. Good talent is hard to come by, and let alone good, competent technical people, not only in the natural resource sector, but specifically more so even in the uranium sector. And I think all of us who have notable demanded time get a sense of a real meaning of time allocation and efficiencies on use of time. How do you straddle multiple companies, balance responsibilities, and justify being across multiple jobs? And how does that work for you on a day by day basis?
Yeah, I'm chairman of COSA, so I mean, I don't get a salary for it or anything like that. My day job is working for Vizsla Copper with Craig Perry and Mike Conard and their Inventa group, looking after exploration there. But I still absolutely love uranium exploration in the basin, and so I am very glad to be able to be a part of it as chairman of COSA, and it just keeps me certainly involved and gives me a chance to add my two bits on overall strategy and things like that. And yeah, it's just and again, it's working with a bunch of people that I really enjoy working with. So it's not really multiple jobs for myself, right? It's a job and then something that I'm doing as a member of the board. Um, and of course, that doesn't take up a whole lot of my time day to day. And to that point, I'm even, again, as I mentioned, on the board of 92 Energy, not as chairman, just a regular board member, but for the same reasons. It's a group that's been doing some really exciting stuff, and it's really fun to be involved with, and a bunch of super people there. So I think that's the best way to sum it up. You look at Keith; he still does a little bit of work for some of the other Inventa Group companies too, like myself, but as COSA has ramped up in terms of activity and significance, then his time is almost completely devoted to COSA these days. So it's not like we're spreading ourselves amongst a bunch of different companies here, and collecting salaries from it all. We are focused on the ones that are paying our salaries. Basically, I guess that's the best way to describe it.
Steve, I think those are good points. And there's a few things I think to put into perspective. And First of all, how I allocate my 16 hours of day is up to me, and it's up to you, Steve, on how you allocate your 16 hours or whatever the hours are. And also that efficiencies play into those time constraints and how much time you use on certain activities. And then I think too, I mean, for us, I would say probably in the neighborhood of 80% of our time probably focused on the uranium sector, but we also spend time in other sectors, copper, gold, to name a couple. Other special situations as well, where we spend and split some of our time not focused on uranium. We still spend a lot of time on uranium, but we certainly have other obligations and engagements outside the sector. And so, also the talented people tend to have a lot of demand for their time. I think that that's another component here as well. Some of this, it sounds like you're doing as a hobby, and certainly some of the stuff we're doing as a hobby. And we're happy to put a little bit of time into it because, we like to spend time here and cut time down in other places that we don't think is useful. And so I think those are some of the other things that I think people need to understand. And it's true. There's also people out there that take a look at some of these companies in the natural resource sector, and they look and identify certain groups and people out there that do take advantage. And by all means, happy to say that that certainly exists. I mean, how many companies and people have we talked to over the years? You do come across certain trends and patterns, and that certainly does exist. But anyway, it's always good to get your take on this from an audience question. And talent in this sector, it's bad everywhere, but talent in this sector and competent people are hard to come by. So if you have less of them, then obviously there's even more additional demand for their time.
For
And
sure.
so any thoughts on that, and then we'll move on.
You're right. It is tough to find people with experience in this sector and find that talent. And you're quite right about the 16 hours too, right? Like I kind of have a day job, but then my evenings are filled with uranium exploration, and that actually worked quite well with 92 Energy because of the time change with the ASX. But still, that's when I get a lot of my uranium work done is evenings. So yeah, I mean, yeah, no, it's definitely tough to find talent. A couple of more names that I didn't mention earlier that are currently with us and fall firmly under the category of talent. Wes Short was with us at ISO Energy, um, looking after most of the corporate function there, whether it be corporate secretary and beyond. And so he's on our board at COSA and just is a terrific guy. Really competent and just a guy that we really like to work with. So glad to have him involved. And then a young lady named Kelly Stasiak who has joined us as an exploration geologist, and she is squarely in that category of young and keen and bright and just the definitely a key piece of this puzzle going forward. And yeah, she'll be helping us a lot with the field work coming up here.
And it's good to be surrounded with some good team. As you know, CEOs are only so good, and they're also based on the team that surrounds them. And I think that's a key point as well. Just as we start to wrap up here, and I appreciate the time, Steve, community efforts, obviously COSA is a smaller company, and, you guys are just starting down this pathway, and obviously there's more to come on community efforts. But we always ask our guests, it's always good to highlight some of the community work that these companies are doing in the community, and obviously sourcing of local service providers and local employment and these various other things that we do on community front. Corporate social responsibility. At this point at SmithWeekly, prohibition of using the term ESG, and that we'll just go ahead and stick with CSR as our acronym. But any thoughts just on the community front for COSA?
Again, I'm lucky to have been mentored by some people who really know what they're doing on that front, and guys like Craig are kind of at the forefront of that. I think tremendous work done at ISO NextGen and other companies that he's been involved in, and so that just kind of filters down, and so yeah, it's something that we take very seriously, and we've been in good discussions with local communities in the areas that we work, and so far, have generally had good support out of that. So yeah, no, we like to hire locally where we can. We like to hire local contractors where we can, and it's super important when you're working in their backyard. So we think it's extremely important.
Stephen, as chairman, talk about how you guys or how you look at this overall company strategy for success and what you would expect to accomplish, say, over the next 3 to 5 years. And essentially, all companies have an ending, so to speak. What is that exit strategy in your vision for this company in the years ahead?
We're in this for the long run, but in the next 3 to 5 years, we want to make a discovery. We want to discover an elephant-sized uranium deposit. We're going to put everything we've got into doing that at Cosa. And then at that point, there will be so many options available as far as what happens down the road. Do we carry on and develop it, or do we, sell it if we get an offer that you can't refuse? Those options will certainly be there. And I think exit strategies will just look after themselves. But the key thing is to find that very large, very high grade uranium deposit. And so that's what we're going to do.
Well said. Well, Steve, to wrap up for today, for potential investors who are listening in, the company has a market capitalization of about 29 million Canadian dollars. Why should Cosa Resources be considered within the institutional, family office, and retail investors' portfolio?
It's really interesting, right? The uranium price has taken right off, and the senior producers and developers have had share price runs that are just extraordinary. But Keith likes to point out that the sub $30 million exploration companies really haven't participated yet in a meaningful way, although that might have changed slightly as of yesterday. But even still, companies like Cosa, I think, are extremely cheap, and that risk capital will flow into uranium juniors as the price continues to go. So I think that just purely on a speculation point of view, companies like ours are going to do well in this run. And as I said, I don't think this run is about to end anytime soon. When you combine that with a company like Cosa that actually has the experience, has the track record of having made some discoveries in the past, then I think that we have a better chance of success than most. So I'll leave it at that.
And Steve, what is the best way for interested parties to reach out to the company?
Yeah, so certainly go to the website, and I believe there's contact information there. They're certainly welcome to email any of the management, get a hold of us. Just check out what's on the website for contact info there.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you again for the time, and keep up the work at Cosa Resources. Thank you.
Andrew, thanks. It's been great. Yeah, you're an easy guy to talk to, so really appreciate the opportunity.